the secret engine of humanity, the true story of the inferiority complex. What if the most universal feeling isn't love or anger, but the feeling of being small, weak, and inferior? What if this feeling, so often seen as a source of shame, was in fact the secret engine of all human progress? Over a century ago, a Viennese doctor named Alfred Adler proposed just that. He believed this feeling was not a weakness to be hidden, but the very spark that drives us to learn, to grow, and to create. This is the story of his revolutionary idea and the profound misunderstanding of it that has echoed through popular psychology ever since. To begin, we must draw a sharp line between two very different concepts. On one side is the universal feeling of inferiority. On the other is the pathological inferiority complex. The first, Adler insisted, is the natural, healthy, and unavoidable experience of being human. It begins in the cradle. As infants, we are objectively small, helpless, and completely dependent on giant, powerful adults. This initial sense of inadequacy is our first and most fundamental experience. But Adler saw it not as a disease, but as a stimulant. It is the engine of our development, creating the necessary tension that pushes us from a minus position to a plus position of competence and achievement. It is the grit in the oyster that creates the pearl. The pathological complex, however, is what happens when that engine stalls. It is not the presence of the feeling that defines the complex, but what happens when that feeling overwhelms us. Imagine a powerful ship's engine that suddenly seizes, or a rudder that breaks in a storm. The individual becomes paralyzed, believing they are fundamentally unable to cope with life's challenges. They give up. This state of discouragement, this cessation of coping efforts, is the true inferiority complex, a crippling belief that makes a person incapable of development. To see the difference, consider 3 lives. First, the story of Demosthenes. According to legend, the ancient Greek statesman had a severe stammer. This feeling of vocal inferiority could have silenced him. Instead, it became his motivator. He trained himself relentlessly, speaking with pebbles in his mouth against the roar of the sea, and through this healthy compensation, transformed his weakness into a legendary strength, becoming one of history's greatest orators. This is the engine working perfectly. Now, picture a child who feels small and physically weak. Lacking encouragement, he overcompensates. He becomes a playground bully, using aggression not as a sign of strength, but as a desperate attempt to mask his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. His psychological engine is running at full throttle, but as we will see, its rudder is broken, causing it to run in destructive circles. Finally, imagine an adult who was pampered and spoiled as a child. The world always catered to them. When they enter a society that no longer does, they feel deeply betrayed. Believing they are unable to cope with a world that doesn't serve them, they retreat from life's challenges, paralyzed by their own discouragement. This is the engine stalled and silent. To truly understand how this engine works and why it sometimes stalls, we must meet the man who discovered it and the revolutionary map of the human mind he created. The man who saw the future. In the intellectual crucible of early 20th century Vienna, one name reigned supreme: Sigmund Freud. But among his colleagues was another revolutionary thinker, Alfred Adler. While many of his peers were looking deep into the past to explain human behavior, Adler did something radical. He looked to the future. He believed we are not pushed by the traumas of our history, but pulled forward by the power of our goals. At the heart of his theory is a concept he called the fictional final goal. Imagine that every one of us, in early childhood, writes a secret story about what it means to be successful, secure, and significant. This story is our personal answer to that initial feeling of inferiority. This subconscious blueprint becomes our personal North Star. It's fictional because it isn't an objective reality. It's a private, personal creation, but it becomes the single most powerful force in our lives, a secret compass that guides every thought, feeling, and action we take. Adler observed that the deeper our initial feeling of inferiority, the higher and more ambitious we set our goal. The energy that propels us toward this North Star is what Adler called the striving for superiority. He later regretted the term's aggressive sound, preferring striving for perfection or success. It wasn't about dominating others, but about the innate human desire to move from a perceived minus to a plus situation, to grow, to complete, and to perfect ourselves. This is the raw power of our psychological engine. But an engine without a steering mechanism is dangerous. This is where Adler introduced his master concept, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, or social interest. This, he argued, was the sole arbiter of psychological health. Social interest is our innate potential for empathy, cooperation, and feeling connected to the human family, a potential that must be nurtured. Think of it as the rudder that steers the ship. This rudder determines everything. When the powerful engine of striving is combined with a strong rudder, high social interest, it becomes a healthy, striving for success for all humankind. But when that same engine is combined with a deficient social interest, it becomes a neurotic and self-centered striving for personal superiority. The striving is the same. The direction given by social interest is the difference between health and neurosis. If this sense of community is the key to health, what happens when it fails to develop? The roots of discouragement. An inferiority complex doesn't appear out of thin air. Alfred Adler believed it grows from the soil of a discouraged childhood, a childhood where a person's natural sense of connection to others is stifled. He identified 3 common situations that can set a person on a mistaken path in life, preventing them from developing the social interest needed to navigate the world. His first major idea grew from his work as a medical doctor. He called it organ inferiority. Adler observed that individuals born with a defective body part or constitutional weakness would often compensate by training that area or developing other strengths. But he also saw how this biological seed could grow into a neurosis if the child became psychologically fixated on it. He soon expanded this idea beyond biology, arguing that any perceived disadvantage, from poverty to prejudice, could become the basis for a deep-seated feeling of inferiority. Next were the 2 parenting styles he saw as most damaging. Pampering. More than any other factor, Adler saw the pampered or spoiled child as the one most at risk. This child is taught that they should receive without ever giving. Shielded from responsibility, they never learn to cooperate. When they finally enter a world that no longer caters to their every whim, they feel profoundly betrayed. Unprepared to face challenges, they retreat, convinced they are incapable of surviving without special treatment. Neglect. The second path is that of the neglected or unwanted child. Growing up without love or encouragement, this child learns to distrust the world. They conclude that they are unworthy of belonging and that life is a hostile battleground. This experience makes it nearly impossible for them to develop the cooperative spirit necessary for psychological health. Finally, Adler pioneered the idea of the family constellation, arguing that a child's birth order could shape their personality. He was clear that it isn't the position itself that matters, but the child's subjective interpretation of their place in the family. The firstborn might feel dethroned by a new sibling. The youngest, often pampered or in a constant state of feeling inferior, may become either dependent or fiercely ambitious. And the only child, never having to share or cooperate with siblings, may develop an unrealistic sense of their own importance. Each of these paths can lead to the same destination, a discouraged individual. Lacking social interest and unprepared for cooperation, this person often develops a powerful but fragile defense mechanism to hide their deep-seated feelings of inferiority, a mask of false confidence. The mask of confidence. We have all met this person, arrogant, boastful, and quick to put others down. We call them conceited. Adler had a different name for it, the superiority complex. But he immediately established its paradoxical nature, for it is not at all what it seems. It is not a sign of genuine confidence, but an inferiority complex in disguise. Adler was clear that a superiority complex is a neurotic defense mechanism, a desperate act of overcompensation. The feeling of superiority and the feeling of inferiority, he explained, are simply different sides of the same coin. Beneath the swagger, the vulgar displays of self-worth, and the domineering attitude of the petty dictator lies a person overwhelmed by a profound sense of inadequacy. The complex is an elaborate mask, an attempt to cover up the very feelings they cannot bear to face. This is the playground bully we met earlier, an individual whose psychological engine is roaring with the striving for personal superiority, but whose rudder of social interest is broken. But it is a failed strategy. This arrogant, non-cooperative behavior inevitably antagonizes and pushes others away. This rejection deepens the individual's social isolation, which in turn reinforces the very feelings of insignificance they were trying to escape. They become trapped in a tragic, lonely loop, where their attempted solution only worsens the original problem. Adler's radical ideas about human goals and social connection did not exist in a vacuum. They were forged in a direct and fierce intellectual battle with the most famous psychologist of all, Sigmund Freud. A clash of giants. In the vibrant intellectual landscape of Vienna, Sigmund Freud was the established titan. He had plumbed the depths of the human psyche and returned with a dark and powerful theory. Alfred Adler was his colleague, a member of his inner circle, but one who dared to break away. Their disagreement was over the most fundamental question of all. Are we slaves to our past, driven by dark, hidden forces? Or are we the creative authors of our own future, pulled forward by the light of our goals? Freud's view was causal and deterministic. For him, our behavior is pushed from behind by our deep past, by primitive, biological drives like sex and aggression. He saw the human psyche as a house divided, a battleground between the warring factions of the id, ego, and superego. Adler's view was teleological and optimistic. For him, our behavior is pulled from the front by the future goals we ourselves create. He saw the personality as a holistic, unified whole, an individuum, or indivisible being, in which every part, conscious and unconscious, moves together in the same direction toward a single unifying purpose. No single idea illustrates their divide more clearly than their view on the Oedipus complex. For Freud, the Oedipus complex was a universal drama. He argued that every child, as a natural stage of development, sexually desires one parent and sees the other as an aggressive rival. It was a dark, biological, and inevitable chapter in every human story. Adler rejected this idea completely. He argued that this phenomenon was not universal and, crucially, not sexual. For Adler, this dynamic only ever happened to pampered children. It was, he insisted, simply an aggressive power struggle. The pampered child, who has been taught to dominate their mother, sees their father not as a sexual rival, but as a threat to their privileged position. Despite the power of his ideas, Adler's optimistic view of humanity would soon be overshadowed by Freud's darker, more dramatic theories. His name began to fade, but not his influence. The unseen river. For decades after his death, Alfred Adler became a footnote in the history of psychology. Freud's name became a household word, synonymous with the field itself. But Adler's ideas didn't die. Instead, they went underground, flowing like an unseen river, quietly nourishing the great psychological movements that came next. He became the unacknowledged inheritance of modern therapy. His influence is most obvious in humanistic psychology. Adler's optimistic, holistic, and goal-oriented theory made him a direct forerunner of this third force in psychology. Abraham Maslow, the father of the famous hierarchy of needs, was directly influenced by Adler. When Maslow described the pinnacle of human development, the self-actualized person, he borrowed Adler's core concept of Gemeinschaftsgefühl, making social interest a primary characteristic of the most psychologically healthy people. Carl Rogers, whose client-centered therapy transformed the practice, built his work on fundamentally Adlerian principles. The idea of an equal, supportive, and encouraging relationship between therapist and client was a direct echo of Adler's approach and a stark contrast to the distant, interpretive model of psychoanalysis. The connection to modern cognitive behavioral therapy is even more direct. Adler's focus on our mistaken beliefs, our private logic, and the fictional goals that guide us was the clear ancestor of CBT's core idea that our thoughts and beliefs create our reality. Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, was emphatic about his debt. He called Adler the true father of modern psychotherapy and declared that his own work might never have existed without Adler's pioneering insights into how our irrational beliefs lead to suffering. After becoming the unacknowledged inheritance of modern therapy, could the world finally be ready to remember the name Alfred Adler and give his ideas the credit they deserve? The Comeback Kid. For years, Adler's theories were criticized in academic circles. The most potent critique came from the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who argued Adler's theory was unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. Popper noted that the theory could explain any behavior and its opposite. A man who pushes a child into water is acting from an inferiority complex, but so is the man who saves the child. The theory was also dismissed as being too much like common sense. But the final chapter of this story is about his ultimate vindication, as modern science and practice are finally catching up to his prescient ideas. His common sense focus on encouragement and community was so effective that it was simply absorbed into the mainstream, where it now lives on under modern banners like strengths-based and community-focused approaches. His principles became foundational to countless evidence-based practices, from social work to parent education programs. But perhaps the most exciting part of his comeback is happening in the lab. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate his central thesis. Researchers are now finding neurobiological support for the importance of social interest, providing hard scientific evidence for Adler's claim that our connection to others is the bedrock of mental health. The story of the inferiority complex, then, comes full circle. Adler's ultimate message is more relevant today than ever. The feeling of inferiority is universal, but it is not a disease. It is a call to action. It is the raw material of progress. By nurturing our innate capacity for connection and cooperation, our social interest, we can transform this fundamental human feeling from a source of suffering into a powerful force for personal growth and the betterment of all humankind.